In 1968, a scientist built paradise. Unlimited food, unlimited water, no predators, no disease, perfect climate. Everything any living creature could ever want. He calculated this population would thrive forever. He ran the numbers. He designed every detail to eliminate suffering. Instead, within 4 years, every single inhabitant was dead. They didn't die of starvation. They didn't die of disease. They didn't die from fighting over resources. They died of prosperity. And if you look at the American labor market right now, if you look at global birth rates, if you look at the quiet quitting epidemic sweeping through every workplace on the planet, you'll realize something disturbing. We aren't just studying this experiment anymore. We are the experiment. And according to the data, we just entered the final phase. Let me tell you about Dr. John Calhoun and his mice. Calhoun was a behavioral researcher at the National Institute of Mental Health. For decades, he was obsessed with one question that nobody else was asking. What happens when you give a species everything it needs? Not what happens when resources are scarce. We know that story. Competition. Survival of the fittest. Darwin wrote that book. But what happens when you remove all the challenges? When you create genuine utopia? In July 1968, Calhoun built what he called Universe 25 at the NIMH facility in Poolesville, Maryland. It was essentially a giant square metal enclosure, about 9 feet across with 4.5-foot walls. But calling it a box doesn't do it justice. This was mouse heaven. The walls had 16 vertical mesh tunnels on each side. These tunnels opened into 400 separate nesting boxes. Think of it like a mouse apartment complex with 256 individual units, each designed to comfortably house 15 mice. That means this enclosure could support nearly 4,000 mice without any crowding whatsoever. But here's what made Universe 25 special. Calhoun eliminated every possible source of stress. The food dispensers? Unlimited. They refilled automatically. No mouse would ever go hungry. The water? Same thing. Flowing constantly. The temperature? Climate-controlled perfection? Disease? Calhoun screened every mouse before entry. No sickness allowed. Predators? None. Nothing could get in. Nothing could hurt them. Nesting material? Abundant. Soft paper for building cozy homes. Space? Massively over-engineered. Even at maximum population, there would be room for everyone. On that July day in 1968, Calhoun introduced 4 breeding pairs of mice into this paradise. 8 mice total, 4 males, 4 females, all young, all healthy, all carefully selected from the National Institutes of Health breeding colony. And then he watched. For the first 104 days, not much happened. The mice explored their new world. They sniffed around. They established territories. They got comfortable. Then the population started growing and growing. The mice doubled in number every 55 days. It was exponential growth, just as Calhoun predicted. By day 315, there were over 600 mice living in Universe 25. Everything was working perfectly. The food systems handled the demand. The water flowed. The nesting boxes filled up with healthy families. From the outside, this looked like proof of concept. Give a species everything it needs, and it flourishes. But something was already wrong. Something invisible was building beneath the surface. You see, Calhoun wasn't just counting mice. He was watching their behavior. He was documenting every interaction. He sat in a loft above Universe 25 for hours every single day, for years, recording what the mice did. And around day 315, the patterns started to change. The population was still growing, but it was slowing down. The doubling time stretched from 55 days to 145 days. That's weird. The resources were still unlimited. The space was still plentiful. Why would growth slow down? Because the mice had stopped acting like mice. The social fabric of mouse society was beginning to unravel, and what Calhoun observed next would haunt scientists, sociologists, and economists for the next 50 years. He called it the behavioral sink, and we might be living in it right now. So what exactly did Calhoun see happening in Universe 25? Let me paint the picture. In a normal mouse society, males compete for territory. They establish dominance hierarchies. They defend their space. They court females. They protect their young. They have purpose. Females build nests. They nurture their pups. They maintain social bonds. They have roles. But in Universe 25, something different emerged. As the population grew, young mice were born into a world that was already full. Not physically full, remember. There was still plenty of space, but socially full. All the good territories were taken. All the dominant positions were claimed. All the social roles were occupied. So these young mice grew up without ever learning normal mouse behavior. They never had to compete for territory because there was nothing left to compete for. They never had to court females because the established males had already claimed them. They never developed social skills because nobody needed them. And this is where it gets disturbing. Some of these males became hyper-aggressive. Without any real territory to defend, they became wandering gangs of violence. They would attack other mice randomly, indiscriminately. Not for food, not for mates. just violence for its own sake. Others became completely passive. They withdrew from all social contact. They found isolated corners of the enclosure and just stopped participating. But the strangest group, the one Calhoun named, were the beautiful ones. These mice gave up on everything. They stopped mating. They stopped fighting. They stopped socializing altogether. All they did was eat, sleep, and groom themselves. That's it. They would spend hours upon hours obsessively cleaning their fur. Their coats became immaculate. Hence the name, the beautiful ones. They looked perfect on the outside, but inside, nothing. No drive, no purpose, no interest in reproduction, no interest in social connection, no interest in anything except their own reflection. Calhoun noted that these mice had never learned to engage in social behaviors. They were physically alive but socially dead. He called this the first death, the death of spirit, which he said preceded the second death, the actual physical death. Meanwhile, the females were experiencing their own breakdown. Normal mother mice are fiercely protective. They build elaborate nests, they nurse their young, they defend their pups against threats. But the females in Universe 25 started abandoning their children. Some would start nursing and then just walk away. Others would move half their litter to safety and forget the rest. Infant mortality skyrocketed to 90%, and it got worse. Some females became aggressive, something almost never seen in mouse society. They would attack their own young. They stopped reproducing altogether. They withdrew into isolated nests and refused to come out. By day 600, the last baby was born that would survive to adulthood. Think about that. The population peaked at 2,200 mice. The enclosure could hold nearly 4,000. There was unlimited food, unlimited water, no predators, no disease, and they stopped reproducing. Not because they couldn't. Physically, they were perfectly capable. But behaviorally, psychologically, they had given up. The mice had everything they needed to survive, and so they lost the will to continue. Over the next few hundred days, Calhoun watched the population slowly die off. The beautiful ones aged. The aggressive males killed each other. The isolated females withered alone. By day 920, Universe 25 was silent. Every mouse was dead. Not from starvation, not from disease, not from violence, though violence happened, from something else, from what Calhoun called the spiritual death of mouse society. He wrote later, "I shall largely speak of mice, but my thoughts are on man." Because here's the thing that haunted Calhoun until his death in 1995. He repeated this experiment over and over. Not just Universe 25, he ran dozens of variations, different enclosure designs, different mouse strains, different starting conditions, same result, every single time. Given unlimited resources and no external threats, every mouse society collapsed, without exception. And Calhoun believed this wasn't about mice. It was about what happens to any social species when all challenges are removed. Now, you might be thinking, okay, interesting mouse experiment, but we're not mice. Human beings are different, and you're right, we are different. We have technology, we have culture, we have complex social institutions, we have the ability to find meaning beyond basic survival. But let me ask you something. Does any of this sound familiar? A generation of young people who have withdrawn from social life, who spend their time on self-grooming behaviors, endlessly scrolling through social media, curating their online appearance, perfecting their digital image, looking beautiful on the outside while feeling empty inside. An epidemic of loneliness affecting over 50 million Americans, even though we have more ways to connect than ever before. Young adults who have given up on traditional life milestones, who aren't forming relationships, who aren't having children, who aren't buying homes, who are just existing. Sound like anyone you know? Let's look at the data. In Japan, there's a phenomenon called hikikomori, individuals who withdraw from society completely, living in isolation in their bedrooms, sometimes for years or even decades. Recent government surveys count over 1.5 million people living this way. That's more than 2% of their entire population. But here's what's disturbing. It's not just teenagers anymore. The highest concentration of hikikomori, over 600,000 individuals, are now aged 40 to 64. Some have been living in seclusion for 25 years or more. They call this the 80-150 problem. Parents in their 80s supporting withdrawn children in their 50s. And these families are terrified of what happens when the parents die. In China, a movement called lying flat, or tongping, exploded onto the scene. Young people publicly rejected the pressure to work, marry, and achieve. They chose minimal employment, minimal consumption, and minimal participation in society. The Chinese government was so alarmed that the Cyberspace Administration ordered platforms to censor negative worldviews, and specifically targeted lying flat content for removal. But censorship couldn't kill the idea. Young Chinese professionals are accepting lower salaries in exchange for more personal time. They're opting out of the brutal 996 work culture, which means 9 in the morning to 9 at night, 6 days a week. Youth unemployment in China hit record highs, with some economists suggesting the real number could be over 40% when you include those who have stopped looking. The government actually stopped publishing the statistics because the numbers looked so bad. And in America, the term quiet quitting went viral. It described employees doing the absolute minimum required, nothing more. No extra effort, no going above and beyond, just showing up, collecting a paycheck, and going home. Here's the number that should alarm you. According to Gallup, 50% of the U.S. workforce now qualifies as not engaged, which is their definition of quiet quitters. Another 17% are actively disengaged, what they call loud quitters, who are negatively impacting their workplaces. Only about 21% of employees worldwide are actually engaged in their work. That's among the lowest rates ever recorded. Now there's a new term, quiet cracking. That's when employees are showing up and doing their jobs, but are mentally and emotionally falling apart. According to recent surveys, over half of American workers experience this, ranging from occasionally to constantly. This disengagement costs the global economy hundreds of billions of dollars per year, but money isn't the real cost. Think about what this means. Millions of people spending 40, 50, 60 hours a week in places where they feel nothing, contributing nothing beyond the bare minimum, building nothing, creating nothing, just existing until the clock runs out. The beautiful ones groomed themselves all day because they had nothing else to do. We scroll through social media all day because we have nothing else to do. They withdrew from mouse society because there were no meaningful roles left. We're withdrawing from human society because we don't see the point anymore. Calhoun watched his mice give up on reproduction when life became too easy. And we? Let's talk about the most Universe 25 thing happening in the world right now, the collapse of birth rates. The United States fertility rate has dropped to an all-time low of around 1.6 children per woman. For a population to maintain itself without immigration, you need 2.1. We're almost 30% below replacement level. This isn't a blip. This is a trend that's been accelerating for nearly 2 decades. CDC data confirms what demographers have been warning about for years. Americans are simply having fewer babies. But America looks healthy compared to East Asia. South Korea has the lowest fertility rate on the planet, around 0.75 children per woman. That's not a typo, less than 1 child per woman. At this rate, South Korea's population will halve in about 40 years. Japan and South Korea have announced joint task forces specifically to address their birth rate crisis. They've called it a threat to national security, which it is. South Korea's military has already shrunk from 600,000 personnel to about 500,000 due to lack of young people to recruit. Japan's fertility rate hovers around 1.2, only slightly better. By 2050, Japan's population is projected to fall from 122 million to 100 million. China, despite abandoning the one-child policy years ago, is facing an even larger crisis. Population loss over the coming decades is projected at over 150 million people. That's like losing half the population of the United States. Now here's where it gets interesting. Everyone wants to blame economics. And yes, housing costs are insane. In the United States, the median first-time homebuyer is now 40 years old, and the highest ever recorded. Nearly 75% of American households cannot afford a median-priced new home. The typical age of a first-time buyer is now just as close to when they can begin collecting Social Security as they are to their high school graduation. And yes, childcare is expensive, education is expensive, everything is expensive. But here's what economists can't explain. Birth rates are collapsing even among wealthy populations. The richest countries in the world have the lowest birth rates. The most educated women have the fewest children. If this were purely about money, the opposite would be true. Even within countries, birth rates often fall after economic conditions improve, not before. South Korea's economic miracle preceded its fertility collapse. China's growth preceded its baby bust. The richer we get, the fewer babies we have. This pattern exactly matches Universe 25. Remember, the mice didn't stop reproducing because of resource scarcity. They had unlimited resources. They stopped because something else broke down. Social connections, meaning, purpose, the behavioral patterns that make reproduction feel worth the effort. The beautiful ones had plenty of food, plenty of space, plenty of potential mates. They just didn't care anymore. And now look at the human data. Surveys show that over half of Americans now say that fewer people having children would negatively impact the country. People recognize this is a problem. But when asked if the government should encourage people to have more kids, the majority said the government should have no role at all. We see the cliff. We know we're headed toward it. And most of us don't think anything should be done. That's not rational economic calculation. That's something deeper. That's a behavioral shift that money can't explain. Demographic projections suggest that American fertility will remain below replacement level for the next 30 years. They're not even pretending it's temporary anymore. South Korea recently reported a slight uptick in birth rates for the first time in 9 years. The government celebrated. But we're talking about moving from 0.72 to 0.75. That's still catastrophically low. It's the difference between falling off a cliff at 60 miles per hour versus 55 miles per hour. The mice of Universe 25 reached maximum population around day 560. They had their last surviving baby around day 600. The end took 400 more days. South Korea hit peak population in 2020. Japan hit peak in 2008. China peaked in 2022. The clocks are ticking. So here's where most analysis of this problem goes wrong. Most economists, most politicians, most commentators look at birth rates, look at workforce participation, look at the quiet quitting epidemic, and they say, it's about money, it's about inflation, it's about the housing crisis, fix the economics, fix the behavior. And I'm not saying economics doesn't matter, of course it does, but I want you to think about something. Right now, major stock indices have been hitting record highs. Asset prices are at or near all-time levels. The US economy has grown despite predictions of recession. Corporate earnings keep climbing. On paper, we're in good shape. Yet consumer sentiment keeps hitting multi-year lows. Americans say they're worried about the economy even as the economy, by traditional metrics, performs well. Here's the disconnect nobody wants to talk about. The stock market is doing great, but that only helps you if you own stocks. And most Americans don't. The majority of stock wealth is held by the top 10% of earners. When the S&P 500 hits a new high, most people don't notice. Housing prices are up dramatically since before the pandemic. Great if you already own a home. Devastating if you're trying to buy one. The home ownership rate has actually been falling. So we have abundance. Massive, unprecedented abundance. More wealth than any civilization in human history. And yet the wealth is distributed in a way that leaves most people feeling like they're falling behind. This is the everything bubble phase. In Universe 25, the mice had unlimited resources. But those resources didn't prevent collapse. In fact, the abundance might have caused it. Here's why. When resources are scarce, social structures form naturally. Hierarchies emerge because they're necessary. Roles develop because survival requires cooperation. Meaning comes from the struggle itself. But when resources are unlimited, the old structures stop making sense. Why compete for territory when there's infinite territory? Why establish dominance when dominance doesn't provide advantages? Why form families when children are burdens rather than benefits? The mice didn't stop functioning because they lacked resources. They stopped functioning because they had too many resources, and the old ways of organizing society became obsolete before new ones could emerge. Sound familiar? Young Americans aren't failing to buy houses because they're lazy. They're failing because houses cost 5 times median income, when historically the ratio was 3. They're failing because average mortgage payments have hit record highs. But even those who could afford houses often aren't buying them. Young Americans aren't failing to start families because they're selfish. Many desperately want families. But the structure of modern life, the work demands, the geographic mobility, the breakdown of extended family networks makes it harder than ever. And young Americans aren't quiet quitting because they don't want to work. Many are working harder than ever. They're just not getting anywhere. Productivity has increased massively since the 1970s. Real wages barely moved. So they're doing exactly what the mice did. They're withdrawing. They're checking out. They're becoming beautiful ones, maintaining their appearance while giving up on the game. Economic analysts have warned that stretched valuations and AI-driven market enthusiasm represent significant downside risks. If a bubble bursts, the psychological impact could accelerate every trend we've discussed. But here's what keeps me up at night. What if the bubble doesn't burst? What if the stock market keeps going up? What if GDP keeps growing? What if the economy, by all traditional measures, stays healthy? Will that fix anything? In Universe 25, the food never ran out. The water never stopped flowing. By every material measure, the mice had it made until the very end. They died anyway, because the problem was never resources. The problem was meaning. Let me tell you about the most expensive health crisis in America that nobody is treating: loneliness. The U.S. Surgeon General has declared loneliness a public health epidemic. He compared its health effects to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. That's not hyperbole. The data backs it up. Loneliness increases your risk of heart disease by 29%, risk of stroke by 32%, risk of dementia by 50%, risk of premature death by 60%. And it's everywhere. According to Gallup, over 50 million Americans struggle with loneliness. 1 in 5 Americans report experiencing loneliness every single day, among the highest rates ever recorded. The World Health Organization has confirmed that 1 in 6 people worldwide is affected by loneliness. Now, that's over 1 billion people on the planet feeling alone. But here's what's truly alarming. The loneliest demographic? Teenagers. According to WHO data, about 21% of 13 to 17-year-olds feel lonely. That's the highest rate of any age group. The percentage actually decreases with age, falling to around 12% among people 60 and older. We always assumed older people were the lonely ones, widows, widowers, the isolated elderly. But no, it's the kids. The generation with more ways to connect than any generation in history is the loneliest generation in history. They have social media, they have video calls, they have messaging apps. They can reach anyone, anywhere, anytime, and they've never felt more alone. American Psychiatric Association surveys found that 30% of adults experience loneliness at least once a week. 10% are lonely every single day. Among Americans aged 18 to 34, 30% are lonely every day or several times a week. Research from Harvard's Making Caring Common project surveyed Americans about what causes loneliness. The top answer? Technology, cited by 73%, followed by families not spending enough time together at 66%. People working too much at 62%. Mental health challenges hurting relationships at 60%. And 65% of lonely Americans said they felt fundamentally separate or disconnected from others or the world. 57% said they were unable to share their true selves with others. This is existential loneliness, a fundamental sense of being cut off from humanity itself. Among lonely adults, 81% also suffer from anxiety or depression. That's compared to 29% among people who aren't lonely. Now think about what this means for society. We evolved as tribal creatures. For hundreds of thousands of years, our survival depended on social bonds. Being cast out of the tribe meant death. Our brains are literally wired for connection. When we don't get that connection, our bodies interpret it as an emergency. Stress hormones flood our systems. Inflammation increases. Our immune systems weaken. Our judgment deteriorates. We become more fearful, more anxious, more withdrawn. This creates a vicious cycle. Loneliness makes us worse at connecting. Being worse at connecting makes us lonelier. The spiral accelerates. Japan was so concerned that it appointed a minister for social isolation and loneliness. They passed legislation recognizing loneliness and isolation as national issues requiring government action. They opened hikikomori cafes and support centers. They created online platforms for the withdrawn. They're treating social withdrawal as the public health crisis it is, but the numbers keep getting worse. Remember what happened in Universe 25. The mice started withdrawing. The beautiful ones isolated themselves. They stopped forming social bonds. This wasn't a choice in the normal sense. It was a systemic failure. The social structures that would have naturally connected them had broken down. The skills required for connection had never developed. They literally didn't know how to interact anymore. And then I read headlines about teens spending 9 hours a day on screens, about young adults who have never had a romantic relationship, about 30-year-olds who have no close friends, about dating apps where people swipe through thousands of potential partners but can't form a single lasting connection, about social media platforms that show us everyone else's curated highlight reels while we sit alone in our rooms. The beautiful ones spent all day grooming because it was the only activity that felt comfortable anymore. We spend all day scrolling because it's the only activity that feels comfortable anymore. So let me bring this full circle. John Calhoun identified 4 phases in the collapse of Universe 25. Phase 1, colonization. The mice explore their new environment and establish basic social structures. This lasted the first 104 days. Phase 2, rapid growth. The population explodes exponentially. Social systems appear to be functioning. This is the golden age, lasting until around day 315 when the population hits 600. Phase 3, stagnation. Growth slows dramatically. Social pathologies emerge. The behavioral sink takes hold. Violence increases. Birth rates fall. The beautiful ones appear. This phase lasted several hundred days. Phase 4, death. The population stops reproducing entirely. The remaining mice age and die without replacement. This phase ended with extinction. Now let's map this onto human civilization. Phase 1, pre-industrial society. Humans struggle against nature. Resources are scarce. Social structures form out of necessity. Phase 2, the Industrial Revolution through the mid-20th century. Unprecedented growth. Medicine extends lifespans. Food becomes abundant. Technology provides convenience. This is humanity's golden age of expansion. Phase 3, the present. Growth is slowing. Social pathologies are emerging. Birth rates are collapsing. A generation is withdrawing from social participation. The behaviors that made civilization possible are breaking down. Phase 4, we haven't gotten there yet. And that's the point. We're not doomed. The mice couldn't understand what was happening to them. We can. Calhoun himself never saw his research as a prediction of doom. He saw it as a warning, a call to action. He believed that if we understood the behavioral sink, we could prevent it. So what do? First, we have to acknowledge that this isn't primarily an economic problem. Yes, we need affordable housing. Yes, we need better wages. Yes, we need support for families. All of that matters. But throwing money at the problem won't solve it if the underlying behavioral patterns have already shifted. South Korea has spent trillions of won on pronatalist policies. Their birth rate keeps falling. The policies address symptoms, not causes. Second, we have to rebuild social infrastructure, not digital infrastructure, real infrastructure, places where people physically gather, activities that require cooperation, institutions that provide meaning beyond consumption. 3/4 of Americans surveyed said they want more activities and fun community events in their neighborhoods. They want public spaces that are more accessible and connection-focused. Parks, playgrounds, community centers, third places that aren't home and aren't work. The mice of Universe 25 had plenty of physical space. What they lacked was social space, meaningful roles, reasons to interact. We're making the same mistake, building endless apartments and offices, but no places where community can form. Third, we have to reconsider our relationship with technology. I'm not suggesting we abandon it, but we need to be honest about what it's doing to us. When 73% of Americans identify technology as the top cause of loneliness, that's not a rounding error. That's a signal we can't ignore. Social media was supposed to connect us. Instead, it's made us lonelier, more anxious, more depressed. The most connected generation in history is the loneliest. That's not a coincidence. Fourth, we need to find new sources of meaning. The old structures, religion, family, community, career have weakened. Many people feel they have nothing to strive for, nothing to believe in, nothing to sacrifice for. The beautiful ones had everything they needed to survive. What they lacked was anything worth living for. And finally, we need to talk about this. Universe 25 has been studied for over 50 years. The parallels to modern society have been noted by researchers, journalists, and philosophers. But somehow this conversation never enters the mainstream. Maybe because it's uncomfortable. Maybe because it challenges our assumption that more is always better. Maybe because it suggests that our problems can't be solved by the next election or the next economic policy or the next technological innovation. The mice couldn't escape Universe 25. The walls were too high. They were trapped in paradise, and paradise killed them. But we can change. We can recognize what's happening. We can choose differently. The question is, will we? Calhoun spent his entire career trying to warn us. In his final years, he worked on ideas for designing communities that would prevent the behavioral sink. He believed in human potential. He believed we could build a world that was both prosperous and meaningful. He died in 1995, still working on that dream. Decades later, every trend he worried about is accelerating. The birth rates, the withdrawal, the loneliness, the beautiful ones. We're not at phase 4 yet, but the clock is ticking. And somewhere, in a lab in Maryland, the empty shell of Universe 25 still sits as a reminder. Paradise isn't enough. We need something more.